Welcome back, everyone, to the Remote Access Redefined podcast. I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia from Conversational Geek. This, of course, is the third episode of the podcast's second season. Over the course of these podcasts' first season, we, of course, discussed the important aspects of OEM and SDK remote access integration. And you can check out that entire season in its entirety at RealVNC.com/podcast and, of course, on all major podcast platforms. Now, in this third episode of our second season, we're going to dive deep into one of the most relevant choices that IT leaders face today. And that, of course, is should remote connections be managed through cloud brokered services or kept securely on premises? And the answer is going to be, I'm going to kind of give it away. It's that it depends. It's the universal answer in IT. When it comes to remote access, there's a fundamental decision that has to be made between using cloud brokered connections, which use external services to establish the secure access, and then maintaining everything within your own environment, but having to configure it, better known, of course, as being on premises. And so today we're going to explore when cloud broker remote access is the option that you should choose and why for some organizations where on-premises remains the only real viable option. And our goal, of course, is to clarify where each model fits and help security conscious organizations like those of you listening or watching make an informed choice. Now, joining me today for this episode are two speakers. We, as always, have Dom Parks. Dom is the lead developer for OEM at RealVNC. Dom, once again, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Nick. Good to be here again.
Glad you're here. And we also have Anton Zdziebczok. Oh, I'm going to murder that. I know I don't want to. I want to say it right, Anton. I really do. Zdziebczok, is that right? Zdziebczok? Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's pretty good. It's a tough one. I'll let you off. It's Polish.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It is. Anton is the VP of Product at RealVNC. Anton, thank you for joining me, and sorry about your last name.
Hey, Nick, that's a good effort. I don't mind that at all.
And before we get into the questions that I have for you both today, Anton, maybe I'm going to start with you since you're the kind of the fresh face here on today's episode. Could you tell us a little bit about your role at RealVNC and your focus day to day there?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a while since I've been called a fresh face, but I'll take it anyway. So I've been with the business a little over 9 months, joined in March last year. I'm VP of Product, so I report into Neil, who's our Chief Product and Technology Officer. And it's my job to spend as much time with customers as I can, understand their pains and problems that they face day to day, and then work with Dom and our other excellent engineers to try and build elegant and hopefully delightful to use solutions for them.
I like that, delightful to use. I think you're the only company that actually thinks that way, but I like that. Dom, and I want the audience, in case they haven't seen one of our previous podcasts together, could you talk about your main responsibility at RealVNC and maybe what your work typically involves there?
Yeah, so I'm lead developer OEM, which means that I kind of often find myself looking after RealVNC software and solutions that are going to interface or integrate directly with a customer's use case or its software or its hardware, even in some cases. So yeah, I'm often working directly with customers to see how we can make their solutions better.
Excellent. Glad to have you both. Now, obviously, it's clear that enterprises have a couple of viable remote access options here on cloud-based brokering and on-premises as well. But there's a need for organizations. They have to prioritize compliance, visibility, security, and that often drives the preference here. And so where I want to start the conversation so we can try to help organizations navigate this is, Dom, I'm going to start with you. And would you kind of explain the difference just for level set, maybe if nothing else, VNC's perspective, although I think most of the people listening already know the difference between cloud brokered and on-premises remote access. Would you just explain the difference?
Yeah. As you say, others might have a different or a subtly different view on this, but on-premises is kind of what VNC began life as. So it's fundamentally a direct connection on a network. Management of the route between the two endpoints is going to be either very simple or quite complex, but either way, it's down to you to figure that out as a sysadmin or as a person using VNC to do that screen sharing. So yeah, it could involve ports being opened, firewall rules modified, stuff like that. Cloud brokering, just real high level, we basically introduce a third component into the whole connection establishment mechanism, and that is a cloud service that the clients on each device can kind of work with collectively to figure out the best way to make that connection. And that the main aim of that is to take care of those sorts of configuration issues that I just mentioned, things like, connecting across networks, complex topologies, avoiding firewalls and NAT and things like that.
And I think with the idea of the cloud brokered connection, there's probably at least some, I don't know if confusion is the right word. Let's say some concern. That's probably a better word here around cloud broker connections equate to storing data in the cloud. Could you just clarify a little bit about how a cloud broker connection actually works, where the data is visible to the provider, where it's stored, all that kind of stuff for the audience?
Yeah. Without wanting to go into too much depth about it, the sort of starting with how it works, which then should hopefully make it quite clear what sort of data we're storing. But effectively, you've got the two endpoints you want to connect. Maybe you've got more, but they're sat on your device. They make an outbound connection to our cloud services, and then that avoids a lot of issues with ports that might be blocked for incoming connections and NAT traversal and things like that. But it also, more importantly, allows us to use some services that we have that are industry standard things called Stun and Turn, and they're part of, I believe it's called ICE, Interactive Connectivity Establishment. And Stun and Turn do specific things. Stun looks at how we can identify the outermost IP address of a device so that we can make a direct connection between those two. And I think Stun actually sounds something like session traversal for NAT. And NAT is one of these things that you'll hear a lot in terms of how you establish a connection over the internet. If that doesn't work, so if the two clients talk to the cloud services, they talk to the Stun service, and you can't figure out a way to make those two connect directly, then the next tool, which I mentioned, Turn, is going to be used, and that's a traversal tool for NAT as well. And that basically will relay the connection between those two endpoints. So they both endpoints talk to that service, and the connection is established through that service. So I think where the concern comes in is, well, I don't want my data going through that service when I connect. And it maybe isn't always very clear as to whether that's happening versus the peer-to-peer connection that Stun might be able to negotiate. But in terms of data stored from that, typically that's just going to be connection metadata. So it's going to be things like the device identifier of some kind, the IP addresses, and in our particular use case, you might have like the names of a person connecting, something like that, and a security tokens, things like that you need to prove that the clients are allowed to talk to those services. But the actual sessions, so the data that people really care about here, the view of the desktop that's being controlled, any info that's typed in, that's always protected by end-to-end encryption. And we can't see that even if we're relaying the connection, because it is end to end, and the clients always assume that they're making a connection in a hostile environment, whether it's our environment or someone else's, like all the wider internet. So hopefully that gives a possibly slightly rambling overview of how it works, but some clarity on what sorts of data is required.
And Anton, just kind of to adding on to this sort of security conversation here, I know that RealVNC put out the Remote Access Trends report earlier this year. And in it, zero trust models actually rank as a very top priority for, I think it was 70% of IT leaders. And so those that are listening or watching today's recording, how would you suggest they reconcile, let's say, zero trust policies that they might have with this need to choose either cloud brokered or on-premises connection architectures? And particularly, I'm thinking around things like where data security is the main priority.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think, as you alluded to a little bit in your intro, it isn't really as binary as yes or no, or cloud or on-premises. There are different situations where different capabilities are required. I'm not sure if you're familiar with something called the Purview model, but it's a network infrastructure that's relatively common in the OT and IT environments. It's got 7 levels, but only sort of 6 of them are named. So you've got level 0, and that's really right at the bottom. That's when you're talking about a physical sensor or maybe an IoT device that's attached to, let's say, a packing utilities device in a manufacturing facility. That's level 0. And then all the way at the top, you've got level 5. And that's your sort of enterprise corporate infrastructure. And somewhere akin to the middle, you've got what they tend to call 3.5. Odd name for it, but there we go. It's known as Zone 3.5. And that's really where you tend to, that's the very bottom layer where you might have a cloud access capability. And there's rules and regulations as well that affect these. Sometimes it isn't just somebody's decision. Sometimes there is a piece of regulation that affects that. You've got IEC 62443, for example, in the industrial and cybersecurity environment. And that doesn't mandate that you should have separated firewalls between those environments, but it very strongly suggests it. And therefore, what you end up having is not this scenario of yes or no. It's a scenario of like, what's the right tool for the environment I'm working in? If you're talking about anything below that level 3.5, so like an HMI workstation or a PLC or a logic controller or a physical sensor, you're going to want some sort of on-premises solution. If you're talking about anything 3.5 or up, that's when you might then consider that flexibility that a cloud-connected platform is going to give you, where you still have strong security. And let's also just be clear, zero trust and cloud and on-premises, they're all different decisions. Zero trust is a way of architecting your network. It's not just a way of architecting network, it's a way of architecting data, it's a way of architecting systems. So you can have zero trust on-premises solutions. You can also have zero trust cloud solutions. You can also have on-premises solutions and cloud solutions that aren't zero trust. So it isn't quite as binary as like, which one do I pick? It's about working out what the right approach is for you as an organization, depending on what you're trying to achieve. If you're in that lower level of the Purgy model, you're really in the sort of heart of the OT world, you're very likely to want to have or need to have a zero trust operation, and much more likely to want tools like the RealVNC on-premises management console to manage access to those devices. And then if you're at levels like 3.5 and above, you might want to take advantage of some of the cloud broking capabilities that Dom mentioned. You can still do that with products like RealVNC and others in a zero trust way. It's more about like your entry point and what those requirements mean for you as a user. And of course, any regulatory obligations that you have to think of as a CISO or an IT director, right?
What also comes to mind on this topic of zero trust is just the idea around identity and the access that identity has. The idea of course, never trust, always verify. And it occurs to me, Dom, I'm going to kind of point this over to you, and Anton, I still would love to get your input on this as well, is some of our earlier podcast recordings and the earlier episodes where we've talked about security. We have mentioned feature sets like integration with identity providers, role-based access, things like that, a use of MFA. And I think where I want to bring this into the conversation, back to my question where I was asking Anton originally, Dom, is those types of feature sets for RealVNC, at least specifically. And then obviously you can't talk for every remote access provider, but for RealVNC specifically, are those feature sets, they're available regardless of whether we're talking about cloud brokered or on-premises based solutions?
Yeah, yes and no. So it's a depends type answer.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly things like MFA, user credentials and stuff like that, that all applies both to the kind of the high level account that you're using to manage your subscription to us or manage your on-premises users. That's one level of authentication, and you might have MFA on that too. And then actually connecting into a device is going to be a separate thing. And definitely, we offer that ability. So when your user is actually connecting in, whether it's on-prem or cloud, you can define however onerous or simple a set of credentials for that connection. And you could define things like a limited runtime to adhere to some zero trust type rule set, and you can define different actions that the user is permitted to do. Like maybe they're only allowed to view this particular device. Maybe they're allowed to copy and paste or not copy and paste and not file transfer and things like that. So all those things should apply to everything, whether it's cloud or on-prem.
Wonderful. Let's actually do this. Let's zero in on the theme of the episode, which is the specific reasons why enterprise should choose either on-premises connections or over maybe a cloud broker one, or which one, or a hybrid of both. And and where I want to start is, Dom, maybe with you. We heard Anton talk about some OT type environments, talk about factory floors. We also know in some of our previous discussions, things like healthcare systems where there's no outside connection permitted in either of those environments. How does on-premises remote access actually ensure that there's this continuous compliant operation that meets that need?
to a certain extent, it's defined by the environment there, isn't it? Because if you don't have that ability to access anything outside, you've got to do it on-prem. You've got to make sure it's going to work without any kind of external cloud providers of any kind. But I think in terms of compliance, on-premises type solutions are really compelling. You've got the control over everything yourself. You can easily demonstrate that no data is going outside of your network if you literally can't send data out of your network, or if you're using an on-premises solution, you can make that point quite easily. So control and compliance, it's a lot easier to demonstrate those things. But yeah, going into more depth on that, any choices about things like the security, network boundaries, access rules are probably much more in your hands at the point at which you're defining everything yourself in an on-premises solution. But yeah, if you do have, say, a situation that isn't quite as hard and fast as you're literally air-gapped from the internet, but you still want to use an on-premises solution for whatever reason, then at least now you've got the knowledge that you don't have to rely on your connectivity to the outside world for any of this to work. If there is an interruption, none of these services are going to go down. You've got something on premise that will, solve this problem for you and keep working, even if power cuts or network issues or even third-party services go down. So that I think that's quite compelling as well.
And Anton, back to the 2026 Remote Access Trends Report that I mentioned earlier, that RealVNC put out. There's this sort of observed visibility gap that exists, that the report pointed out, between leadership and those that are managing remote access. And it actually sort of suggests that there's this need for auditable trails. We need to know basically who connected, when, for what purpose, those kinds of things. Can you talk a little bit about having remote access brokering on premises can empower organizations to answer those questions around audit trails?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the big benefits of taking a tool like RealVNC's on-premises management console is that because it's not brokering necessarily typically in the same way that the cloud is doing in terms of brokering the connections, but it's refereeing essentially what's going on between those viewers and servers. And all of that data gets reported back into a centralized location in a similar way to the cloud environment does, but with the benefit being that it's locked down entirely within your environment. And that gives you one single place to look at from an audit perspective. It gives you one centralized location for that data. It gives you one area to harden. One typical way that customers might try to do this is they might use, for example, the local event logs on a device, and then they've got to send those local event logs out to a SIEM or some other centralized place. When you're doing that, you have to harden the environment that sits around your SIEM, but you also have to harden each of those devices as well, because there's no good making sure that your SIEM is really nicely protected and is in the right structure and the right state if the data that's being fed into it can just be changed at any point from that local machine. So by passing that responsibility for audit into the activity that's captured through the RealVNC on-premises management console tool, you can worry a little bit less about what those edge locations are doing and focus a little bit more on the central piece. And not only that, it also just makes it much easier. Instead of you as an organization having to have complicated structures and processes set up to make sure that you're capturing event logs from here or event logs from here or event logs from there, you just have to go to one place where you can view and explore and interrogate those. And then if you want to interact that with some other kind of like logging tool you've got or observability or SIEM tool, it's got APIs there that you can use to do that if that's what you want to do. So I think it's really important for organizations, especially anybody who, falls under some of that regulation that we've talked about before, whether it's HIPAA or the more specific regulations, IEC 62443, for example, right? You are having by regulatory requirements to make sure you have that indelible audit trail, right? That is something that you need. It is not a want. It's not a desire. It's a requirement. And so I think having something that helps you facilitate that can only be a positive thing for these organizations. And you mentioned that like visibility and also, I guess, sort of like gap between the people managing them and the people who have that overall responsibility. That's really quite common in these situations, right? You've got something that makes somebody's life better, might make somebody else's life harder. And that absolute requirement around making sure you're capturing and having that audit trail might be slightly more difficult for the lower level manager to deal with, but it's a requirement of the person above who might be the one that's like reported from a regulatory perspective. So yeah, I think it's important to have that considered and tools like the on-premises management console that do that central auditing recording are helpful for doing that in a very similar way to the way that the cloud does as well for those customers that don't have those on-premises requirements.
And the idea of regulatory requirements, I'm glad you brought that up, Anton, because it kind of ties in with security, even though we know security and compliance aren't exactly the same thing. There's a lot of overlap there. Dom, when we're thinking about on-premises remote access and going back to Anton's mention of regulatory requirements, it makes me want to ask the question around, does on-premises remote access address data residency, sovereignty better than cloud brokered solutions, or how does it fare in comparison?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is yes, probably yes. It does. I don't think there's any way to get around that. It's just as before, as I said earlier, it's far easier to demonstrate that any regulated data types, anything that you should be keeping within the boundaries of either a country or a state or whatever, is kept if you're not sending it off to some cloud provider that you don't have a huge amount of control over, don't even necessarily know where they're located. It's unambiguous, basically. I would argue that with the sort of minimal connection metadata that I mentioned before, that our cloud brokering requires, and the actual fact that there's end-to-end encryption anyway, that probably would be compliant with most regulatory requirements, particularly if we look at sort of where the data is actually accessible, which is the endpoints only. But I don't think the regulations make that sort of detail part of their compliance requirements. So they're quite strict about residency and jurisdiction, and they probably don't make any distinction based on if the data is going out, it's going out. It doesn't matter whether it's encrypted, perhaps. So yeah, I think again, simple answer is yes, it does help.
I think, Dom, you're absolutely right there that having that very explicit binary divide is really, really helpful. Makes me think of a previous life I've had where I was talking to an organization and they were looking for some tools in the compliance and risk space. And the answer the guy gave me is, well, I'm never going to get fired for picking N supplier, right? It doesn't actually matter whether supplier N and supplier Y might be able to do the same job. If your regulator is using supplier N, you're not going to get fired or fined for using supplier N. And I think that's kind of where you sit sometimes with these data residency things. Yes, the cloud, as Dom says, is very safe and good to use. And the way that we're doing the sort of end-to-end encryption really should mitigate most of those concerns somebody has. But if it's on premises and it doesn't leave your network, you just don't even have to think about it. And it's just like you can segment that whole problem into a little pile of, I don't need to worry about it. Whereas with the cloud, although it might be very safe and it might be very secure, there are some situations where, there's no need to take that risk, right?
Well, let's talk about that a little more, because I want to talk about the RealVNC's on-premises management console. It obviously differentiates it from any kind of internet-connected management platform. And Anton, maybe I'll just stay with you here. We've outlined before what an internet connection broker type of remote access how that would operate. Dom did a good job of that. And so maybe what we could do first is have you outline how on-premises management console makes it easier to manage connections, maybe the licensing, what makes it different from a traditional VNC deployment as well?
Yeah, cool. So let's talk about what a typical offline VNC deployment might have been in the past. As Dom mentioned, it's a fairly simplistic approach. You have a server installed somewhere and you have a viewer installed somewhere else. And those two components, they speak to each other. And that's all that happens. You need to have and maintain a license on each of those server devices. And then on each of the viewers, you've got to manually build your list of connected devices, right? We call that an address book at RealVNC. Other providers might call it something else. But for us, you've got to manually build that address book. And because they're separate devices, there's nothing that's really providing that centralized who's doing what to who or where. It's just device A is speaking to device B. What the on-premises management console brings you is a central, and I've used this term already today, I don't think of it as a central referee, right? It sits somewhere in your infrastructure. And we also have the concept of things called zones, where you need to have separated segmentations even within that one environment. That's possible as well. And each of those zones or on-premises management console is responsible for not the communication between those two devices. As Dom mentioned earlier, that's still happening peer-to-peer. That's still a real-time connection between those two devices. But for the activity in and around it, it helps manage and maintain it. So you have things like essential audit methodology that we talked about earlier. We have the concepts of users. Like, that's not normal in a typical offline VNC deployment. Your individuals might log into a Windows or a Linux or a Mac device, and then they open the application, but there's nothing that requires them to sign in or use that device. So even if your log is able to say, IP address 172.6859 has contacted the remote server, you don't know who's done that within there. Whereas what you're able to do with the on-premises management console, because we require people to log into the viewers, is who has done that activity as well. And that is really important. It's not just which devices have engaged with each other, but who's done that activity. So that also brings some benefits from there as well. I mentioned the address book earlier with the on-premises management console. Because we know all of the devices that you have licensed through the on-premises management console, we're able to build that address book for you dynamically. If a device leaves or joins the network, if an administrator has added a new device, that automatically appears in your address book when you load or when you refresh the viewer. And so that information is front and center for you. Sounds like a little thing, but you'd actually be surprised how much time some of our customers end up spending maintaining those address books. And having that centrally managed by the on-premises management console is really, really good. And then the other thing, and this is, I guess, maybe quite a basic thing, but I think also something that I've had a lot of really positive feedback from customers about, is the licensing. So historically, previous and in other VNC deployments offline, you have to go and provide a license key or a license file for each of those servers. And that doesn't sound like a lot of work if you've got 20 or 30 servers, but if you've got 500 or 1,000 or 25,000 servers, that's a lot of work. And those licenses expire after a period of time. Of course they do. We're a software business, right? That's how it works. With the on-premises management console, that license is now just in one place, right? So you put your RealVNC on-premises management console license into the console, and that console then propagates out a license to each of those devices. They check in on a regular basis to make sure that they're still licensed, but you're not having to push out that license to 10, 5, 15, 20, 50, 100,000 devices, right? It's just one license goes into one place. And that, I think, will have a really positive impact. And that, although for me kind of feels like table stakes from a capability offering, is something that I've seen really positive opinions on and feedback from our customers on.
Kind of trailing on that idea of trying to make it easier for those that have to manage this. You talked about licensing, Dom. I'm going to switch to you and think about maybe the administrator's view, the person has to actually manage the product itself. How does an on-premises console actually alleviate the maintenance, the complexity, the things that's normally assumed that goes along with installation and use of an on-premises solution? Is it similar to the licensing? What should the audience expect?
I think, I think if I just pick up on some of the bits that is basically what Anton said, perhaps with a little more focus on the installer part, because if you were to think about some of the things that Anton mentioned as being challenges, like how do we manage the licenses, how do we manage the audit trail? If you're doing that all on-prem, you've got to come up with those solutions for yourself, and it might be that you need to have a database here or a script redirection process of some kind. But we've packaged up all of those required elements into one installer, hopefully, or a couple of installers with the zone feature. So that's got the console itself and the services that you need into a simple to use installer that runs you through the configuration, deployment, management, it gives you a step-by-step guide for how to get the servers joined to that and add users and things like that. So you then don't need to go away and create your own, probably just a list somewhere of what devices are licensed and what devices are accessible and why, and who's put this device somewhere behind some firewall, why is it in this room, and that sort of stuff. You can have that all listed in one single pane of glass sort of thing with the on-premises console. So yeah.
So obviously we've painted a real nice rosy picture, if you will, for an on-premises console. Anton, I'm going to throw this back to you. What about a hybrid scenario where we blend a cloud brokered and an on-premises remote access solution? One, is that possible? Why would customers choose that? Does it have to be exclusive only? They have to pick one or the other. And then I'd love to add on to this. We've talked about a number of factors and how on-premises consoles apply to that, whether it's things like regulation or data sovereignty and so on. Just would you touch maybe ever so lightly when we talk about a hybrid scenario? Does any of that change?
Yeah, great question. So let's answer your first one first. Can you do it? Yeah, absolutely. What we do typically see, though, is a separation of those and them being treated as separate things. So you would have your on-premises management console managing and licensing those offline devices. So again, pull us back to this Purgy model, because that's really where we see this hybrid happening in reality. Everything from sort of like level 3.5 and below, that's typically where you would expect that lives in the offline world. So you might have your on-premises console installed behind your OT firewall. So that's managing and owning all of your things to do with OT. And then above that, where you tend to sit in your sort of like outside the DMZ and your enterprise network and your corporate IT network, that's when you might want to take that cloud brokered solution, because you're not exposing physical devices on a factory floor or machines in a healthcare setting or anything, or high security devices in a military or government environment. You're sitting outside of that. And so that's where those cloud brokers tools, the benefits and the advantages you get, because let's be clear, there are some really good things that the cloud brings to the table that you just can't do in the offline environment, because it's just not feasible or practical to do that. And so you can take advantage of those toolings in the right environment. And I think that's the thing that's really key. If I could give one takeaway to anybody from today's conversation that we're having, is that it isn't just yes or no or right or left. It's thinking about what you're doing, what your obligations are from a regulatory perspective, what your needs are as a user, and picking the right solution for that, or picking the right combination of tools for that. If you're responsible for a wide, highly secure OT production environment, on-premises is likely to be the best bet for you, right? That's just the reality of it. You may even find that you don't have a choice about it, because in some jurisdictions there's some regulation that affects that. Maybe that doesn't affect you, but that's likely to be your solution. If you've got a mixture of devices that are sitting, in a higher level of network infrastructure, some of them might not connect into your network for days at a time. Some of them might be distributed devices out in the field. That's where those cloud broking solutions make a little bit more sense. You don't have to be sat behind a VPN. You don't have to be deeply buried inside a network infrastructure. You're much more sort of internet or edge exposed. And that's where those cloud broking solutions are really reliable. And as I said, those benefits you get from them, you can make the max from. And this is something we see in reality with customers. We have customers that take both services and products for us, and they have typically that exact sort of separation. They've got that lower level infrastructure where, even between their plants, their manufacturing plants, those manufacturing plants can't talk to each other, let alone speaking to a third party external service. That's just not even a thing. It's not even a conversation you can have. And then in their higher level enterprise and corporate infrastructures, the cloud broking services are fantastic, because they're bringing a whole bunch of, expedient capability and ease of use to those IT individuals that are managing that infrastructure.
But it's evident here from the conversation that each model meets some very specific needs for a given organization, and the answer might even be hybridizing both. Is hybridizing a word? If not, it is now. I'm going to use it anyways. Yeah. Excuse me. But maybe what I'll do is I'll try to narrow in the focus here. We'll try to help organizations kind of decide what is right for them. So Dom, I'm going to start with you. So for organizations that are thinking about safeguarding their networks and their data and so on, maybe what would you say is the most compelling reason to consider an on-premises solution?
Yeah, I'm gonna say control, and that just gets to the heart of everything. You can have all the regulation and things like that you like, but really what it comes down to is that having something that's purely managed by you, sits within your network, lets you more or less define and prove exactly how identities and policies, routing, credentials, all audit logs, all these things, how they're handled, and there's no external dependency on it. So yeah, that just reduces your risk. It sort of simplifies any audit that you might have to do. And yeah, going back to what we said before, where you have an environment that's got an on-premises solution, but it is connected to the wider internet, it means that you can continue even if the internet has gone for you. So yeah, I think it's control.
And Anton, what's your advice around whether it's choosing or maybe blending a cloud brokered solution with an on-premises remote access solution in 2026? When's the right opportunity for organizations?
I think the right opportunity is when you are thinking about what is important to you as an organization. Dom talked about control there. I think that's a really valid point. We've talked a lot about the impact it has on the IT side of the organization. There's also impacts that have felt much wider than that as well. I'm sure we've all been through like ISO audits, right? And the reams and reams of documentation you've got to go through for each of your cloud service providers. Not even from an IT management perspective, but just from a legal perspective and a contractual perspective. So I think it's important to think about all of those elements and pick the tool that's solving the challenge you have. If your role and your challenge is about making sure that the environment you're operating in is the most secure environment, it's the most resilient. Don talked about access to the internet earlier. If you're relying on cloud brokered solutions and your factory gets disconnected from the internet, hard to imagine, but I'm sure these things can happen, right? Like that's going to have a really big impact for you. So if data security and resilience and control are your number one drivers in that environment, then an on-premises solution is just going to perform better for you. That's the reality as far as I'm concerned. If those aren't your key drivers, if they're important for you, security should be important for all organizations. That should be a cornerstone of everyone's approach, in my opinion. If you don't have quite those same sort of ironclad rules in place, and your focus is more around ease of deployment, management capabilities, the flexibility that some of the cloud brokered solutions give you, and maybe, I guess, potentially a slightly lower burden of maintenance, because although on-premises tools are awesome, and we've talked about them a lot today, the reality is you're running a system. And so there is a little bit more burden for you. You've got to maintain and manage that server that on-premises solution runs on. You've got to make sure that you're keeping any dependent pieces of software on there up to date. When RealVNC releases the next version of it, you've got to go and install it. Whereas with our cloud offering, when we release new features to the cloud, those features just work for you. That's how cloud solutions work. So there is a little bit of burden, a little bit of cost involved in that. If you don't have those hardline requirements, then as long as you're picking a provider like RealVNC, who's got its security credentials in order, that's thinking from the ground up about how we build the most robust and safe and reliable solutions for our customers, cloud connections might be the solution for you. I think that's the most important piece of advice I would give is what is most important to you? What is most important to the environment you're working in? And that will, I think, lead you to a relatively obvious answer.
That's a great way to sum things up, Anton. I think that kind of puts everything nice and neat in a little bow and everything here. So thank you for that. I appreciate that very much. That is all the time that we do have today. If you'd like more information on RealVNC Connect and its on-premises management console, you can visit realvnc.com. And remember, of course, this is only the third episode in season 2 of RealVNC's podcast series. So be on the lookout for future podcast episodes on your choice of podcast platform. Thanks a lot for listening. We'll catch you all on the next one.